Good evening. Welcome to our weekly program on Sparks, tidbits of the Parsha. This week, the Parsha is Vayehi V'Yom HaShmini, or just for short Shmini, referring to the 8th day. Now, the number 8 is a significant number in Jewish thought. We find, of course, the miracle of Hanukkah was an 8-day miracle, and a lot of literature has been written and published to explain why Hanukkah was an 8-day miracle and not a 7-day miracle. We know the holiday of Sukkot is 8 days. We know the circumcision, the bris, is on the 8th day. And this parsha is about the 8th day of dedicating or inaugurating the Mishkan, the tent of meeting, as it's called, Ohel Moed, or the tabernacle, the sanctuary, the portable one that they traveled with in the desert. And for 7 days, last week we read about 7 days of inauguration, of preparation, of chinuch, preparing for the ultimate day when the Mishkan will be dedicated. And that was last week. And this week we begin Vayehi, and it came to pass V'Yom HaShmini, on the 8th day, and it continues with the whole process of how it was dedicated, the sacrifices that Aaron brought, because the 7 days Moses was the one who was officiating and training his brother Aaron and Aaron's sons. But in this parsha, Aaron is now taken over, and as the parsha continues, God responded favorably by sending fire to consume all the offerings, which was the sign that God said, I accept what you have been doing, I will dwell amongst you. And you have to remember, this is in the aftermath of the golden calf, when God was upset at the Jewish people, and now God has said, I have fully not only forgiven you, but I'm willing to dwell in your midst. Because in the forgiveness process, there were different stages. The first stage was that God listened to Moses and didn't destroy the Jewish people. The second stage was when he came back with a second set of tablets. The third stage was when they started to build the Mishkan. The fourth stage is when they completed the Mishkan, but that happened in the month of Kislev. But when was the Mishkan dedicated? That was the beginning of the month of Nisan. This is already 1 year after the story of Pesach, of Passover. That moment, this day, was the most incredibly joyous day. The Talmud in Tractate Megillah says, Vayehi B'Yom HaShmini, and it came to pass on the 8th day, that this was a day of great joy for God. This is as joyous for God, the Talmud says, as the day in which heaven and earth were created. So the Talmud asks a very interesting question. There's a principle in Torah interpretation that whenever the word Vayehi appears, Eina Ela Lashon Tzara, or Lashon Tsar, it's an expression of pain, of anguish. It's not a very positive expression. So how could you say that this was a day of great simcha, a great joy? And the Talmud answers that, yes, this day was a day of great joy, but it was marred by the death of Aaron's 2 sons, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But absent the tragedy that followed, this was an incredibly holy and positive time. And it's as great as the creation of the heaven and earth. But what does it have to do with the word Shmini, the 8th day, which was what we began discussing? Because in Jewish numerology, the number 7, the Midrash says, is a beloved number. It represents the pinnacle of spirituality. Shabbos, the Sabbath, is on the 7th day. The 7th month is the month in which we have all the holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Simchas Torah. The sabbatical year is 7. Moses was the 7th generation from Abraham. So 7 represents the peak of spiritual perfection. So then what is 8? 8 is the number of transcendence. 7 is still a system. It's still part of a program. When you reach the number 8, means you've transcended even the most sublime spiritual programs, because any program, by definition, has its parameters, it has its limits. So you can be a very spiritual person, but if you carve out a comfortable niche and that's where you stay, you have achieved perhaps the number 7, but not the number 8. And the number 8 manifests itself in many different ways. For example, when was the Torah given to us? After they counted 7 weeks of 7 days. So 7 times 7 represents the perfection within perfection. The Torah was given on the 50th day. Count 50 days, we count 49, because the 50th day is the transcendence, the beginning of the 8th week. At any rate, this day represented reaching beyond the norm. That's why this answers a question: why does the Torah break the story into 2 different sections? Last week we read about the 7 days of preparation, and today we read about the 8th day. It should have been all put together. It's part of one continuum. The answer is no, it's not part of a continuum. What they did until now pales in comparison to what they accomplished on this 8th day. Now, God tells, if you're following in a text, it's chapter 9 and verse 2. And in the verse 1, Moses summons Aaron, his brother, and Aaron's sons, and the elders, and he says to Aaron to bring a sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? A young bull for a sin offering, and a ram for an elevation offering, as they translate it here, or a burnt offering, unblemished, and offer them before God. So what is he telling Aaron to do? For the sin offering, to take a young bull, which in Hebrew is egel. Now, isn't that a common or a familiar word? Sure. That's the word for the golden calf that caused all the problems. That Aaron had a very great involvement in making it happen, as we read a few weeks ago. So here, Aaron is told to bring an egel, a calf, to atone for the sin of the golden calf. That was his sin offering. And what about the Jewish people? They were to bring seir izim l'chatos. They were to bring goat for a sin offering, and a calf for a burnt offering. So the question is asked, why is it that Aaron brings a calf for a sin offering, whereas the Jews bring a calf for a burnt offering? In addition to the goat that they bring for a sin offering. So one of the commentaries explains it as follows. When a person commits a sin, there are 2 parts to every sin. There is the act, and there is the thought, the intent. If you commit a sin without the intent, it's called shogeg. It's unintentional. It doesn't make it right, still needs an atonement, but it's not as severe as when you do it intentionally. Now, Aaron was involved with the golden calf, but what was his degree of involvement? Was there intent? Absolutely not. In fact, Aaron's intent was to try to sway them and talk them out of the worshiping of the golden calf, to delay. And it didn't work in the end, so he was involved physically, but not involved mentally. Now we know that a sin offering is for the action that a person does. You bring it even for unintentional. A burnt offering is for the thought. So Aaron brought the egel, a calf, to atone for his involvement in the golden calf as a sin offering for the actions that he did to procure and to facilitate the golden calf. The Jewish people, on the other hand, they had 2 things to atone for. They had to atone for the action, because they actually constructed and some of them worshiped the golden calf. But they also had to atone for the intent. That's why they brought the goat for a sin offering, to atone for their action, and they brought a calf as a burnt offering to atone for their thought. Now a question is asked. Aaron is bringing a calf, an egel, to atone for the sin of the golden calf. There's a principle in the Talmud relating to Yom Kippur. Why did the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, wear white clothing when he entered into the Holy of Holies? Whenever he did any service that pertained to Yom Kippur, he would wear white. He wouldn't wear his golden vestments. So the Talmud says, because of a principle, Ein kategor na'aseh senegor. A prosecutor cannot become a defender. Gold is the prosecutor. What caused us to make the golden calf? The fact that we had all this gold. And we were looking for trouble because of all that gold. So how could a Kohen Gadol who's trying to procure atonement for the Jewish people come into the temple and even into the Holy of Holies with golden clothing, which would invoke the memory of the very cause of their sin? And you're trying to get atonement. You don't want to bring in the prosecutor, so to speak, the element that brought you to this point. So the Talmud says that's why the Kohen Gadol had to avoid using gold. So the question is asked, so why would Aaron take a calf? That would certainly invoke the memory of the golden calf. And the answer is really very simple. There's a difference between when you're doing something for atonement in general. You don't want any side obstacles to come in and somehow mess up your process of getting atonement. You're bringing atonement on Yom Kippur for all your sins. Why bring up the golden calf, which would only exacerbate the problems that you have and make it harder to procure atonement? You don't want to bring the prosecutor in when you're defending yourself in another case. It's like a person who's on trial for one crime, but he's also being charged with, or has been charged in the past with another crime. You don't want to bring in the other crime while you're trying to get off on this one. But when you're trying to deal with the crime itself, the crime of the golden calf, you have to take, to paraphrase, to use the cliche, take the bull by its horns. In this case, take the calf by its horns. And you have to focus on the calf, because that is exactly what you're trying to atone for. Now, Aaron, Rashi tells us, had to be prodded by Moses to get involved. He tells him in verse 7, Krav el ha-mizbeach, approach the altar and do all these things. Bring your sin offering, bring your burnt offering, so on and so forth. Why did he have to tell him to prod him? So Rashi says, because Shahaya Aaron Bosh, Aaron was embarrassed. His commentaries explain he had good reason to be embarrassed, because he caused the golden calf. True, unintentionally, he didn't want to do it, but he still did cause the golden calf. So he was embarrassed. He felt, I'm not worthy. And Moses tells him, Lom atabosh, why are you embarrassed? Lekach nivcharta, this is the reason you were chosen, or you were chosen for this. Both translations fit here. So one commentary says something very beautiful. How could it be that Aaron, the holiest of people, in some ways he was compared to Moses, equal to Moses, some ways even greater than Moses, one of the holiest people that ever lived, how could he have been implicated in the most terrible crime that is known to us in the Torah, which is idol worship? All the explanations that he didn't want it and he didn't mean it, they're all true. But still, how could God allow a holy man like this to even be tainted in the slightest, in the most subtle of ways? And the answer is that when a tzaddik, a very righteous, pure, innocent person, has to help atone and cause others to atone for their sins, he can't do it for them unless he experiences the same sin in himself, albeit in a very subtle way. There's a famous story of the second Chabad Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, who, after hearing a Jew come to him telling him of something that he did, a terrible sin, the Mittler Rebbe shut the door and for the next few days was involved in deep introspection until he opened the door and allowed that person to come back in again, and he told him what he can do to atone for his sin. And he explained later that when a person comes to me to ask for a way to atone for a sin, I can't help that person unless I myself have some semblance, some very subtle form of that sin. And when this man came to me and told me of his sin, I couldn't find it in myself, so that I couldn't help him until I was able to dig deep and find that imperfection. Now, we could be sure that this holy person's imperfection is probably something that we would wish for on Yom Kippur in our highest level of spiritual excitement. We would want to be as imperfect as that tzaddik was. But nevertheless, on his level, his imperfection is the key to his ability to help those who have gross imperfections. Aaron, in order to atone for the Jewish people, he had to be implicated in the very same sin on a very different level, true. But he had to be able to atone for his own sin as a way of helping those to atone for their sins. And that's what Moses tells him. Aaron, you're embarrassed because you worship the golden calf? You were chosen for that, not for the service in the temple only. You were chosen to have the sin of the golden calf so that you could atone for others. Now, the tragedy occurs after the fire comes down and consumes the sacrifices. Aaron's two elder sons, Nadav and Avihu, bring an unauthorized sacrifice. And as a result of the fact that it was unauthorized, a fire descends from heaven and consumes them. And the entire Jewish people are now in mourning, grieving. Aaron, of course, more than anyone else, losing his two sons on this very happy day. And the Talmud looks for different reasons why they died. The simple reason is given in the Torah, because they were not commanded. But to be struck down like that because they were not commanded, so the Talmud has several explanations. One of them is that they were, I don't want to use the word intoxicated, but they were shetuye yayin. They had drunk wine. They imbibed before they entered the temple, the sanctuary. And how do we know that? Because right after their death, God says to Aaron, don't drink before you enter the temple. So from that we deduce that their sin was that they did drink. So the question is, if they were not yet commanded not to drink, why were they punished? You can only punish someone if they do something that they know is wrong, because they were told not to do it. But here they were not told. It was only after the death of Aaron's two sons that Aaron was told, and that was something that he had to pass on to his children and their children, not to drink before going into the temple. So why were they punished? And the answer is alluded to in Rashi's words. This is something that the Rebbe once said at great length. Rashi says, Moshel ben Bias. This can be compared to a ben Bias. What is a ben Bias? Ben Bias is someone who lives in your home, who experiences what you experience, who picks up every nuance of your life, who understands your desires and your preferences. And if a person like that does something that is wrong, that goes against the host's desires and preferences, you can't say, well, you never told me not to do it, because a ben Bias, someone who grows up in your house, has to know it better. Nadav and Avihu were not just simple people. Moses said to his brother Aaron, they are greater than us. In other words, level, they were superior to Moshe and Aaron. They were so close to God, they had to know that God would want. Now, the question is, why did they drink? If they were such holy people, why did it enter their minds that they should drink? And the answer given by commentaries is that when a person drinks, it awakens certain hidden feelings. It removes a person's vulnerability. A person is no longer has no inhibitions, and you could express things that were there deep down in your heart that you would have expressed otherwise. In the words of the Talmud, "Nichnas yayin yatsa so." The wine enters, the secrets come out. So they wanted to reveal deeper levels of their spiritual passion for God. Well, then why wrong? And the answer is that's an artificial way of doing it. They didn't have to drink wine to reveal their spiritual potential. You have to remember who they were. These were the holiest people around. They were in the vicinity and close proximity to Moshe and Aaron, the two greatest Jewish leaders. They were, besides their own greatness and the fact that they were around such great people, the timing. This was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the first of Nisan, which, according to many opinions, is Rosh Hashanah, is the day in which the world was created. And as we said before, it's the day that God had such joy, the day like the creation of heaven and earth. So they were in the holiest of places. This is the Mishkan, the divine sanctuary, the holiest of times, the holiest of people. All these three levels of holiness converged together, and they had to take wine to reveal their spiritual passion. That was considered to be a sin for them at this level. Of course, there are many other deeper explanations, but we're not going to have time to go into much more about the children of Aaron. Now, it says that as a result of this terrible tragedy, by Yidom Aaron was silent. Aaron didn't say anything. So the Medrash asks, rhetorically, what could he have said? It's a very strange question. I mean, anyone who suffers a bereavement and expresses anguish and pain is something that you would expect that anyone who went through this would express. But the Midrash says what he could have said was, on the 8th day you're supposed to circumcise your son. What does that mean? It's a very cryptic Medrash. And I think the simplest way of understanding that is Aaron could have tried to justify God, because after all, this is the happiest day of his life, Aaron's day, and God does this to him. He could have justified it and said, it's the 8th day, and we know what we're supposed to do on the 8th day. We're supposed to bring an offering of our own child. Circumcision is compared by our sages to an offering, to a sacrifice. So Aaron could have said, you know what, I can understand God, why he allows this to happen. He could have rationalized that this is God's desire for me to bring a sacrifice. But he didn't do that. Because God does not need, nor does he want us to justify his actions. Yes, we accept the fact that whatever God does is just and right, and in the days of Mashiach we will understand it. But right now, God doesn't want us to understand pain and suffering. He wants us to reject and do everything in our power to pray to him that there's no more pain and suffering. So Aaron did not engage in rationalizing his pain and suffering. But we're going to skip over to near the end of the Parsha, where it talks about the laws of what makes an animal kosher. We know that an animal, to be kosher, has to have two distinguishing signs. It has to have split hooves, and it has to chew its cud. It has to regurgitate the food and chew it again. Torah lists 4 animals that have one of the 2 signs, and they are all non-kosher. Most other animals either have none of the two signs, the majority, and there are some animals, cows, sheep, goats, and a few other species that have both signs. Now, a sign of kosher means that the sign represents, it symbolizes a positive trait. So the Rebbe, in one of his talks, explains what is the significance of the split hooves and of the chewing its cud. So the Rebbe explains as follows. When we engage in a physical experience, such as eating, which means that we're connecting ourselves to the material aspect of this world, the first thing is that you have to have a hoof. There has to be a separation between you and the physical world. You can't be totally immersed in materialism. But that hoof also has to be split. When something is split from the top to the bottom, it allows the light to enter. In everything that we do, as we engage the physical world, we have to allow the light, the spiritual elements to enter, to inform our behavior, to edify our behavior, to elevate it, to make it holy, that even the physical is holy. But even that is not enough. When we deal with the animal aspects of existence, that's what the kosher animal is. It refers also to our own animal soul. And we want to engage the physical world, and we think what we're doing is right. Our interaction with the physical and material world is justified. We have the hoof, it's split, the light comes through, but we can't just assume that what we're doing is right. We have to then rethink what our level of interaction will be. Only then do we know that it's kosher. We also know that fish, in order for them to be kosher, they have to have scales and fins. What do the fins represent? Talmud says that every fish that has scales has fins, but not every fish that has fins has scales. So we start first with the fins that are more common. Most fish have fins. What do the fins represent? Mobility. That's what propels the fish. A human being cannot stay in one place. Yes, it's more convenient to be in one place because it's a place that we're familiar with, it's a place that we have experience with, and we feel safe and secure. But life is not about feeling safe and secure. Life is about taking risks. And we're talking here about risks in the spiritual sense. We're not talking about business risks. That a person can't say, I want to stay at one level. You have to constantly strive to go to higher levels, to find new venues to express your spirituality, your divine connections. But that's not enough to make you kosher. Because when you do move, you become vulnerable. You become more vulnerable to attacks that will undermine your spirituality. If you stayed at one level, you might be more secure because you're accustomed to all the challenges. You know exactly what to watch out for. But as soon as you start climbing, you will discover so many different forces and challenges that will try to knock you down. That's why you need the scales. The scales represent the protection as you are mobile. The end of the Parsha. One other thought about kashrus before we go to the end. There's a very puzzling statement in the Mishnah, Tractate Kedushin, at the end, that a shochet, a person who slaughters meat and makes it kosher, is a partner of Amalek. Very puzzling statement. Amalek is the arch enemy of the Jewish people, the epitome of evil, the embodiment of unmitigated evil, to the extent that the Torah requires of us to never forget Amalek's treachery and to obliterate the memory of Amalek. Amalek produced the Hamans of the world, the Hitlers of the world. And yet we're comparing a shochet who's, throughout Jewish tradition, always very conscientious, always making sure that everything that he does is meticulously kosher. His knife that he uses to slaughter the animal has to be checked for the slightest nick. In Jewish law, a shochet has to have more impeccable credentials than even a rabbi, because we put so much trust in the shochet. And yet the Mishnah is comparing him to the most evil of nations. My grandfather, of blessed memory, said a very beautiful observation and answers this question. He says, throughout Jewish history, we were threatened by our enemies, of course, who wanted to destroy us. But the greatest threat to us came from the threat of assimilation, of intermingling with other nations and becoming like them, which is what happens to every nation in the world. A minority gets swallowed up by the majority and assimilates, and they're gone. Culturally, spiritually, they're gone. The Jewish people resisted assimilation. Well, of course, there are many individuals who did assimilate, but we're talking about the Jewish people as a whole. We are the greatest miracle that we're around after 3,300 years of persecution, of threats of assimilation, enticement, and all the other pressures that we have endured. What is the secret of our survival? Of course, it's a miracle. But even a miracle that God does has to have some way of explaining what is that we did to deserve that miracle, or how did we become recipients of that miracle. And there are two reasons, two things that kept us together. One of them, tragically, is anti-Semitism, hatred of the Jewish people. Because we were hated by our enemies, Amalek being the ultimate enemy, and we were excluded from society because of that anti-Semitism, that forced us to remain ourselves, to not lose our identities. But that's a negative pressure. Another pressure that kept us was keeping kosher. By virtue of Jews being required to eat certain species of animals, of birds, of fish, not mixing milk and meat, or slaughtering the animal the prescribed kosher way, not partaking of the blood and certain forbidden fats of the animal, not eating the sciatic nerve, and even plant life. There are laws that restrict what kind of plants we're allowed to eat or not allowed to eat, which we won't go into right now. But all the dietary laws have forced us to not assimilate with those nations of the world who did not adhere to these dietary rules. So if you really think about it, what kept us separate and intact? It was either the negative force of anti-Semitism or the positive attachment to keeping kosher. So that, my grandfather says, is what the Mishnah means, that the shochet, the one who provides kosher food, is a partner of Amalek, because they both were strange bedfellows, you could say, opposites, but they both had the same effect of keeping us together. And I would just add that to the extent that we strengthen our own positive reasons for our lack of assimilation, for our uniqueness, we won't need the negative reason. It will strengthen us without having to resort to be the victims of anti-Semitism to keep Jews together. At the end of the Parsha, it says, Lahavdil, ben hatamei and ben hatar, to distinguish between the contaminated, the impure, and the pure, ben achaya hanecheles, ben achaya shalosa achel, between the creature that may be eaten and the creature that may not be eaten. This is the last verse that concludes the discussion of kosher food. And one of the commentaries who comments on the remez, the hints in the Torah, points out that this verse, there are not too many verses like that, begins with the letter Lamed and ends with the letter Lamed. Lamed in Hebrew is the number 30, and 2 times 30 is 60. And this is the hint in the Torah to the rabbinic law that when a food gets mixed up with other food, a non-kosher gets mixed up with kosher food, in some cases you are allowed to eat the entire mixture if there's a ratio of 60-1. That means if someone is cooking a pot of cholent, a pot of stew meat, and then someone who is drinking coffee passes by the pot and a little drop splatters out of the cup into that pot and it's now mixed up, could you eat that meat? And the answer is, if there's a ratio of 60 times the amount of milk, the entire mixture is 100% kosher. That's the concept of bitul b'shishin, that the negative is nullified by 60. And the hint in the Torah, everything is hinted in the Torah, is that this verse, it sums up the laws of kashrus between that which is kosher and not kosher, adds up to the first and last letters, add up to the number 60. Now the number 60 is also significant. We find that used in a lot of other places as well. For example, it says in the Talmud that a dream is a 60th of prophecy. Sleep is a 60th of death. That means the term 60th is used when you have a minuscule amount of something that can become nullified, but up to 60 still has a trace of the larger, it still has a significant trace that could undermine that process of nullification. And the hint to that can be found in this verse. In conclusion, the entire Parsha, which we said before is entitled Shmini, about the 8th day, is a very relevant one to the concept and the belief in Mashiach. Mashiach, it says, is one of the 8 princes, the Talmud says. Mashiach's harp that will be used in the temple in the future will have 8 strands as compared to the strands of King David's harp that had 7. Why? Because Mashiach will reveal an unconventional force of spirituality. And one of the ways of hastening the coming of Mashiach is through our commitment to the laws of kashrus. It's one of the Rebbe's 10 mitzvah campaigns, but it's singled out very likely because it has the capacity to reveal the uniqueness of the Jewish people and produce an end to the exile caused by Amalek, the evil forces in this world, and bring us back to our land in the Beis HaMikdash with Mashiach. Have a good evening.